Hi everybody, my name is Eduardo Xeren and I will present a paper titled Usefulness of Growth Differentiation Factor 15 Levels to Predict Diabetic Cardiomyopathy in Asymptomatic Patients with Type 2 Diabetes mellitus, published in the American Journal of Cardiology in 2014 by Domingos Rodrigues, Abreu Gonzalez, and Avanzas. So, growth differentiation factor 15 or GDF 15 was described as a macrophage inhibitory cytokine 11, member of the transforming growth factor B cytokine superfamily, and produced in response to oxidative stress and inflammation by multiple cell types including macrophage, adipocytes, and cardiovascular cells. GDF15 is associated with increased risk in fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events in community dwelling subjects and in patients with cardiovascular disease. In patients with diabetes, type 2 diabetes mellitus had high circulating concentration of GDF15 levels. The aim of the present study was to observe the association of GDF15 with diabetic cardiomyopathy in patients who never present symptoms or signs of heart failure. Initial, a total of 527 patients with diabetes mellitus from outpatient diabetic clinic was included, but 324 was excluded by having a pre-existing disease as coronary artery disease, hypertension, and other, with the total of 213 individuals completed this study. It's a schematic view of the methods applied in this study. So all subjects signed an informed consent in accordance with Declaration of Helsinki, and the protocol was approved by local ethics committee. Diabetic cardiomyopathy include left ventricular diastolic dysfunction in absence of arterial hypertension, ischemic heart disease, and other heart disease. In the first days of analysis was taken a complete history of individuals, blood sample was taken too, and clinical examination with a 12 lead electrocardiogram, echocardiography, and treadmill exercise tests. Left ventricular diastolic dysfunction was assumed in accordance with consensus statement of the diagnosis of heart failure with normal left ventricular ejection fraction, published by the Heart Failure and Echocardiography Association of the Europe Society of Cardiology. A criterion for a left ventricular diastolic dysfunction assumed was the ratio between early mitral valve flow velocity E and early diastolic lengthening velocity E line. Treadmill exercise test was made with Bruce protocol to exclude coronary heart disease. Ischemia, ischemia on the exercise electrocardiograms was assumed with presence of horizontal downsloping of ST segment, depression of over 1 millimeter over baseline, 3 or more consecutive beats in two contiguous leads during the test or during the first 3 minutes of recovery. Serum GDF-15 was measured by immunoabsorbent assay, and BNP was measured by immunoassay. Statistical data was present as mean, more or less standard deviation, or median with interquartile range. Okay, another statistical methods. And so the principal result was the left ventricular diastolic dysfunction measured by E-line ratio. So we can see that individuals with diabetic cardiomyopathy has 17.15 ratio against people who don't have diabetic cardiomyopathy was scored by 10.4. So GDF-15 values was higher, much higher in individuals with diabetic cardiomyopathy, ranged in 5,273 picogram per milliliters against individuals without diabetic cardiomyopathy with a little bit more than a half, with 2,812 picogram per milliliter. So the odds ratios is almost 1, 10 is 9.9, okay, and was the unique independent predictor of diabetic cardiomyopathy. There was a significant correlation between GDF-15 levels and the E-line ratio. Also, a hoc analysis showing the power of GDF-15 to predict diabetic cardiomyopathy with 0.83 in the area under the curve. So, in type 2 diabetes mellitus, subject without history of symptoms or sign for heart failure, GDF-15 are markers of diabetic cardiomyopathy. Other diseases are excluded to avoid confounding and assess only myosin alteration caused by hyperglycemia. Duration of diabetes mellitus is one of the most important factors in development of all diabetes complications, including diabetic cardiomyopathy. GDF-15 was not a significant difference in patients with and without diabetic cardiomyopathy. Hyperglycemia is a major risk of myocardial dysfunction, and in present study glycate hemoglobin in patients with diabetic cardiomyopathy was lower than in group without the disease. Significant correlation between GDF-15 and functional indicators of diastolic function such as E-line was observed. Previous studies show that GDF-15 levels may partially represent an underlying pathophysiological mechanism for diastolic dysfunction. GDF-15 may potentially be an indicator of impairment in diastolic function, as an acute or chronically elevated filling pressure. Example, E inline ratio. The correlation between GDF-15 and diabetic mellitus has been observed in community dwelling subjects. Diabetes is a main determinant of GDF-15 levels in patients with established cardiovascular disease. Elevated GDF levels could be a robust and independent predictor of diabetic cardiomyopathy, superior to other predictors such as clinical parameters and BNP. GDF-15 is not associated with age and body mass index. GDF-15 levels may reflect a pathophysiological change occurring in the left ventricle. In the mouse models with myocardial infarction, aortic stenosis, and heart failure, hypertrophied infilling human heart, and GDF-15 levels may reflect this process, is also associated with left ventricular remodeling in patients with acute myocardial infarction. A long-term increase in GDF-15 in patients with diabetic cardiomyopathy playing an adaptive or maladaptive role remains to be investigated. BNP was not be used to predict diabetic cardiomyopathy, and the use of the BNP in the detection of diabetic cardiomyopathy is still controversial. BNP had a higher prognostic than diagnostic role for diastolic dysfunction and diabetic cardiomyopathy. Patients with diabetes mellitus had BNP levels that were significantly higher than patients with left ventricular diastolic dysfunction. And the limitation of this study was the use of treadmill exercise in protocols testing for the exclusion of coronary heart disease has a low sensitivity for that. They study don't use a long-term follow-up, especially it is a cross-section design. Although association have been found, direct causal relations cannot be attributed. Thank you.